Hi, I'm Cindy Vasco, and it's a pleasure to be part of the 2021 Literary Hill Bookfest. I'm a photographer and urban explorer, meaning I photograph abandoned sites. Additionally, I combine those two loves with my third love of writing. I have 9 books published about abandoned regions within the United States, and an additional 4 books are in the publishing queue. Since I live only a few miles from the Washington D.C. border, I consider D.C. as my special city. So my 8th book, Abandoned Washington D.C, Evanescent Chronicles, is very close to my heart and featured in this presentation for the Literary Hill Bookfest. Abandonments in general inspire curiosity and often reveal beauty in an interesting dark manner. One might find abandoned settings alarming and desolate, while others see forgotten history, fascinating decay, or nature's green hand reclaiming its space. Photographs of empty places provide us with an alternative view of the world without us. In Washington, D.C., a province rich with our nation's history, anything abandoned is either hastily torn down, tagged, or senselessly vandalized. Still, some forlorn structures remain and hold timeless beauty, or better yet, have a second chance at life along with the preservation of history. Not only does my book feature a collection of abandoned D.C. locations, but I also devote a chapter to the deserted and surreal representation of Washington, D.C. in the time of COVID during the lockdown phase in spring of 2020. Join me on this short journey to some forlorn D.C. sites that appear in my book and step into the unfamiliar, discover a new way to look at history, and perceive the soul of what once was. Visiting an abandoned brick factory was my first urban exploration undertaking and my initiation into the urbex subculture. Since my relocation to the DC metropolitan region in the 1980s, I often passed by these strange domes and was always curious as to their purpose. These beehive-like structures were once furnaces that fired clay excavated from the nearby Anacostia River banks. Only the ruins of 3 kilns remain from the original 12. The factory's roots originated in 1909 and operated until 1972. Hidden in plain sight within a DC park is an enormous footprint of stones cloaked with vines, covered in moss, canopied by mature trees, with many stones holding detailed markings. All of this seems like the remnants of a lost civilization. These stones hold rich history as they were once part of the Capitol's East Portico, removed in 1958. When the East Portico stones traveled along the Potomac River toward Capitol Hill in 1824, the stones held a sacred status. Now, these historical markers unceremoniously languish in the woods. The former East Portico columns, however, command a more revered spotlight. The columns stand tall on an elevated mound in the National Arboretum, thanks to the efforts of a women's group that lobbied to have the columns rescued from rotting crates on a swampy piece of government property. A school of distinction, established in 1869 as D.C.'s first high school, Franklin School, was once the school for the president's children. Franklin was the flagship school of D.C.'s 8 urban schools erected between 1862 and 1875. Deserted for decades, Franklin School was gifted with a new but still scholarly hat. A few months ago, the historic site opened as an interactive language arts museum, Planet Word. Deep beneath the pavements and humming din of DuPont Circle is a derelict streetcar hub, holding a series of tunnels, platforms, and streetcar tracks commanding over 75,000 square feet. This subterranean facility, abandoned for decades and now known as the DuPont Underground, recently transformed into a unique arts center space where creatives can showcase artistic talent. The large imposing ivy-colored cylinders dominating a large plot of fenced land along North Capitol Street always piqued my interest from my first days in this region. The Stonehenge-like cylinders are part of the abandoned Macmillan Sand Filtration Site, once a vital cog for the cessation of DC's typhoid epidemic at the turn of the 20th century. With the typhoid crisis out of control in the early 1900s, the DC government embarked on an ambitious construction plan for a new water supply distribution framework that incorporated sand for the filtration of water. Once Macmillan was operational in 1905, the typhoid scourge abated. The facility ceased operations in 1987. Other chapters in abandoned Washington, D.C. feature schools, a historic church turned to art center, a famous hospital, large greenhouse facilities, some artful graffiti, often forever decorations in so many forlorn locations, and an assortment of interesting and abandoned scraps that claim a bold presence within DC's bounds. Still, I could not complete this book without a reference to the DC environment during the spring 2020 quarantine phase. The images of vacant spaces, once dynamic, capture a departure from our norms and instead present an alternate reality absent of our presence. The spring lockdown drove abandonment to a novel level. Images of evacuated streets and institutions made our common spaces unfamiliar. As I shot the silent streets, I often felt alone in a desolate, haunted space, and unlike the abandonments I visit, this setting was neat and tidy, and so very unnatural to my urbex eye. So many images of city life assume that hordes of people are always present, but in the time of COVID isolation, these scenes expose only a few lonely figures, if any. The bigger picture, though, is that the fear of the pandemic has fostered a new fundamental fear, the fear of each other. COVID DC's panoramas expose how swiftly we become estranged from our everyday lives and how our surroundings can suddenly become unstable. Images of empty public spaces, like photos of abandoned places deserted for decades, reveal the myth that we are indispensable to such space existence. When will normality return? Dramatic reality reshaped our mindsets and forced us to absorb and internalize everything as we solo walk through the new COVID reality. I hope our resilience pushes through the strangeness of our prolonged detachment. Yes, I still have hope. I hope you enjoyed this brief look into the uncommon DC environment. A special thank you to Karen Lyon, Liz Kogan, and all of the associates of the Literary Hill Bookfest for allowing me to have the opportunity to partake in such a wonderful DC event.